Hello, my name is Hayley Denbraver, and I want to welcome you to my talk, Developing a Security Mindset, Practical Lessons for Pythonistas. I'm Hayley Denbraver. Let's jump into this. All right, so today we're going to talk about developing a security mindset. And this basically boils down to the idea that I want to encourage you to approach your code more skeptically. Think about where it might be weak and think about the ways it could be compromised and take small steps at first just to make it better, to shore it up a little bit and to make yourself more secure. Now, this means that we're going to talk about software security, but don't worry, because although we are talking about security, we are going to do so with whimsy and mystery and super fun hats. It's basically Halloween, right? It's all good. Okay, so with whimsy and mystery, let's get this started. So this talk is going to feature three amazing detectives from British detective fiction, the very best. We have Hercule Poirot, Sherlock Holmes, Miss Marple. I'm never going to keep that up, so we're just going to go with their actual names and not their puns. Hercule Poirot, Sherlock Holmes, and Miss Marple. Now, these detectives are going to have something to say about software security, and I hope you all are along for the ride. I know that I am, along with my Python avatar here. If you are new to security, just think of yourself as keeping company with this adorable Python, right? She's new to software security too. It's okay. All right, so let's meet our detectives. First, we have Miss Jane Marple. Miss Jane Marple is a bit of a busybody. She knows a lot, maybe arguably too much about her neighbors and their relations, things like that. She is often underestimated and she's always listening, so you can never really count her out. Additionally, she is thoroughly educated and she has a good brain, some nice logic, common sense, but she is not formally trained. All right, so let's talk next about Hercule Poirot. He understands psychology. He believes in the predictability of human behavior. He's fastidious. He keeps his cards close until the right time. And he can spot when someone is pretending to be something that they're not. And then our final detective is Mr. Sherlock Holmes. He observes minute details and is able to extract information from that. Additionally, he knows that you don't necessarily need to leave your home in order to dig up some interesting information. And in my opinion, that makes him a pandemic hero, which I love it. He is a thorough researcher. He questions assumptions, and he ignores rules when they don't suit him. And here's me, or past me, maybe you could say. I was new to software security. I hadn't really been involved with it before. I had been called naive. I didn't want to believe people would do anything bad or that I was working on something that would be worthwhile to break into. And security just overall seemed overwhelming and unfriendly and like it really wasn't for me. So we are going to have several questions for for these detectives, and we're going to use those questions to discuss software security, hopefully in a way that past me Python avatar would have found helpful, and hopefully you'll find helpful too. So the first question is, what do you know about your neighbors? And for this question, we are going to go to Miss Marple. She is up to date on the latest goings on. She has an understanding of the general character of her neighbors, and she knows who associates with whom. She exposes bad actors and never sugarcoats her assessment of what's going on. The recommended reading here is The Murder at the Vicarage by Agatha Christie, which is the very first Miss Marple novel. All right, so when I ask you if you know your neighbors, in terms of software security, what I'm really asking is whether you understand vulnerabilities in your open source dependencies. All right, so let's talk about your neighborhood. This is a dependency tree for the very first Python project I ever wrote years and years ago. Now, what you see here is that there are projects that I chose to incorporate, and then those projects also had dependencies, and so they're brought in too. And these little color things indicate where issues are. And so they came in both from projects that I chose, but also projects that were included through the dependencies of my dependencies. That makes sense. All right. So if you think about your neighborhood, your own code, and then all the code you use, and all of that code living in production, you may think that your code takes up a really big part of the neighborhood. And maybe that's true. But as open source becomes more widely adopted, as there's so many projects to pick and choose from, and you can use the power of open source to not spend your time reinventing the wheel, things like that. Maybe your production code looks something like this, but it could just as easily look like this or this or this. And that is a lot of real estate in your neighborhood that you personally didn't write. That's not to say that open source is bad, but only that if the code is in production, you own it. And so you better understand what's going on there. So what should you know about your neighbors? Well, you should know if any of the packages you use have problems, if there are known security vulnerabilities. And additionally, you should know which packages your packages use, so your indirect dependencies, and you should know if they have any issues. Then that way you can make an informed risk assessment, an informed decision. So how do I keep track of all of this? And what I would say here is to automate where you can. There are open source and enterprise options for you to do this, and I've listed a few here. So to summarize, understand your open source dependencies and remediate known issues. Use a tool to help you do this, and there are open source as well as enterprise options. Just choose whatever fits you best. All right, so our next question is, are people who they say they are? So let's turn it over to Sherlock Holmes and Hercule Poirot. Basically, this is a trope that comes up all the time. People are pretending to be someone they're not. And so there's a lot of discussions around how do you confirm identity? What does a name really mean? And just kind of grappling with these issues. How do you confirm an identity? And one thing I would say is that if there is an actor in the story, you should be suspicious because there's probably somebody pretending to be something they're not. And then the recommended reading here is kind of long because it just shows up all the time. So any of these are awesome examples of this trope in detective fiction. Oh, I don't know how Sherlock Holmes does it. That's not very comfortable. So we'll put that aside for now. All right, let's talk about authentication and permissions. So what should you know about authentication in Python? First, I would say don't roll your own auth. Second, I would say don't store plain text passwords. Don't do it on a sheet of paper on your desk. Don't do it in a text file on your computer. Don't do it in a database. Just don't do it. Use two-factor authentication in all your personal accounts wherever you can. And additionally, if you work on a project that has users, please offer two-factor authentication for your users. It is a way that you can help your users protect themselves. You help them, and then they help you by using this two-factor auth, and hopefully nobody breaks in. Like it's a win-win situation. And finally, I would say that Django doesn't throttle user authentications by default, and so you should use a complementary tool to do so. You don't want someone getting in by brute force. All right, so what should you know about permissions? Well, I would say here that you really want to be as granular as possible. You need to remember that it's always easier to grant a permission, an additional permission that someone is missing and should have, than it is to revoke a permission that was given, but that was not applied well or correctly. And then additionally, I would say that you need to think about your perimeters. You don't want to be so busy barring the door that someone gets in through a window that you didn't even think about. So think about how people interact with your projects and where those perimeters are and what you can do to keep people within the areas that they're allowed to be. All right, and an interesting reading I would recommend for this one particular issue of perimeters is The Case of the Speckled Band. It is a story by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, including Sherlock Holmes. It is a locked door mystery. So basically the door is locked, the window is locked, there's a murder that happens in the room, but how did the murderer get in and out? And so you end up thinking about all the ways that are possible to get into this room and then out of this room unnoticed. And I promise you this is real, but it actually involves a snake. So I think you should all read it. It's a quick read. So The Case of the Speckled Band. All right, to summarize, treat authentication and permissions conservatively. Don't roll your own auth, and be explicit about the perimeters in your projects and apply permissions carefully. All right. So the next question, should I trust this mysterious package? And for this question, we're going to turn to Sherlock Holmes. He once had a case where a client received severed ears in a package, all packed with salt. In another case, a client received 5 orange pips. And for non-Brits like me, an orange pip is basically the seed. And it was actually really nefarious, and it was terrible code, and his client died. It was actually only one of 2 cases where a client died after seeking Holmes's help. So no, Holmes does not think you should trust that mysterious package. And here what we're really talking about is injection, user uploads, deserialization, and typosquatting, basically anything that you get from outside of your project that may be compromised. All right, so if we think about handling unknowns, there is a saying, in real life, trust but verify. And I really think that it should be the other way around. Verify and then trust. Assume anything that comes to you from the outside could potentially be compromised. All right, so one way this shows up is SQL injection. And I would just offer a couple words of advice here. First, I would say write raw SQL sparingly, if at all. If you don't have to, don't do it. It's a lot safer to use an ORM like the Django ORM or SQL Alchemy, something like that, than it is to execute raw SQL queries, especially if those queries start out as strings that have user inputs formatted into them. That's where someone could really do some damage. So you want to be very careful with them. Use the ORM, it's there for a reason. And just be very, very thoughtful about whether you need to use raw SQL or not, because in all likelihood, you don't have to. All right, so let's talk about user uploads. If you have a user upload, confirm that it is what you expect it to be. If your user is uploading a picture, if you expect a picture, check to see that it's a picture and not, say, a script. If you're not careful with user uploads, you can expose yourself to the risk of code injection. And on kind of a related note, if you ever received serialized data, pickled data, you want to be very careful and really think about whether you want to unserialize it, deserialize it, unpickle it, whatever. If you do that, it really can be a Pandora's box type situation. And there's no way to know what's in that serialized data until you deserialize it. So don't mess with it unless you are 100% sure that you trust the source. And this actually had something of a Python ecosystem application fairly recently. Basically, there was an insecure default in NumPy. It's fixed now, so it doesn't trust serialized data by default, something like that. I wrote about it back in 2019, and you can read it here. I'll post the slides to my Twitter. And then one more way that you can receive severed ears from the internet is by pip installing a package without checking its name. Basically, a malicious person could create a package that is compromising, and they could, in theory, upload it into PyPI. And then if it's close in name, either a typo or a very close name that you might guess for another package, you could end up installing this malicious code. And there actually was an instance of this as well. There were some typo squatters in the Python package index, and they were booted quickly, but it is a proof of concept. Like, this can happen. Don't guess any names of things you pip install. Don't do it. So to summarize, be wary of inputs and uploads. Don't guess. All right. Another question is, how do you handle sensitive information? And this actually, all of our detectives have something interesting to say about this. They understand that information is valuable and that it is sometimes dangerous. They tend not to reveal their hunches before the appropriate time. They will explain their methods if it's important, but they won't do it if it's premature or if it could compromise something. They don't always tell the authorities the full story. And actually, like, across the board, all three of them have discussed for blackmailers, because blackmailers wield personal information as a weapon. And we're going to talk about source code and user data and how we should handle it and treat it and be careful with it. So first, let's talk about source code. You want to follow good code hygiene practice regardless of whether the repository is public or private. And this includes things like not committing sensitive information to version control. And it also includes things like keeping in mind that a problem could come from within your own organization, within your house. That's where the issue could lie. And that's part of why you need to be careful with your code hygiene, whether your repository is public or private. Now, when we think about user data, I really like to be selective. I think that it is a totally valid question to ask whether you need to collect the data, whether you need to store the data, whether maybe you need the data, but you need some help handling it securely, and there are places and things that you could delegate to groups and organizations that do this better, right? If you don't collect the data, you can't lose it. And that is a win right there. So I would also say that it's important to give your users tools to protect themselves. Earlier, I mentioned that if at all possible, you should give your users the ability to use two-factor authentication. It protects them, but it also protects you, because a malicious party is less likely to be able to log into their account and cause problems, cause data loss, things like that. And just as a final note, I like to encourage people to think about personal data like glitter. If you have a tube of glitter and you just dump it on the sidewalk, you are never getting that data back. It is going to go everywhere, is going to turn up in places you don't expect, and you can never, ever get it all back in the tube of glitter. So if you approach data like that, I think that's the sort of seriousness that you need to bring to the table here. All right. So to summarize, both source code and user data deserve careful consideration. You can't lose data that you don't collect. Git is amazing, but it's not for everything. And yeah, that's a summary of user data and your source code. All right, so for a final question, we're going to ask, are you up to date on your knowledge of cigar ash? And this question is for the one and only Sherlock Holmes. He is constantly learning about his field. He's an experimenter. He shares his findings with Scotland Yard. For example, his treatise on all the cigar ashes in existence. He is willing to do things in new ways and share his insights. And so this is really about the importance of continued learning and forward progress. Security is a continual process. You're never secure and then you're done and you check that off and you never have to think about it again. That does not happen. New vulnerabilities are found, new exploits and attack vectors are executed, and you just have to keep going. This is true on a personal level, thinking about your own personal practice and your own code, but it's true on a company level and on an industry level. And it's actually really nice to see that PSF is investing in this sort of thing. They have recently put time and money into modernizing and updating some of their infrastructure. There have been changes within the Python packaging authority, and they, in general, are a more secure organization today than they were a few years back. And that is through purposeful investment and just investment in time and resources and all the planning that went into this. So thank you, PSF, for leading the way and for leading by example. I think it's really great. So to summarize, security is never, ever done. Good security is a product of continual learning and iteration. All right, so to close, I want to encourage you to approach your code with skepticism. It is okay to ask questions about your code and poke at it a little and try to find weaknesses. It's better if you find it than if someone else does. Be willing to ask the question as, a question like, where is my code maybe a little weak? What kind of exploit might be tried against my project? And try to break it. It's a really interesting process to learn by doing, and I just encourage you to never be afraid of asking questions of your code and poking at it and prodding it a little to see how you can make it better. So I have a few resources for you if you want some additional reading on Python and security. These will be on my Twitter. And just to close, my name is Hayley Denbraver. I'm an experienced developer advocate, and I'm looking for my next role. Anyone in the community, I would love to hear from you. You can find me on Twitter, Hayley DenB, or my email address is there. And I just love Pythonistas, so I would love to hear from you. I would like to say thank you to my wonderful artistic mother, Noelle Cook, who drew all the snakes. I love them. I'm a little obsessed, and they're just great. They're great. And most importantly, I want to thank you and all the organizers at PyTexas. Thank you for being flexible with your event. And hopefully one day I can see you all in Texas in the semi-near future. It's been great. Thanks so much, PyTexas.